Welcome to the Dennis Report. I'm Dennis Atchison. We are now 3 weeks left in a federal election campaign. There's already 8 weeks past, 11 weeks, the longest in Canadian history. At the start of the election, we at the Dennis Report tried to contact all of the candidates for New Brunswick Southwest and for Fredericton-Oromocto. We worked hard trying to get everyone in the room at the same time. Unfortunately, we weren't successful. So what we're offering you now are the 3 interviews we were able to do with candidates in NB Southwest and in Fredericton-Oromocto. We hope you enjoy how these people bring their passion to politics and ask for you to vote for them. First up will be Matt DeCourcy, who we interviewed almost a year ago before he was even the official candidate for the Liberal Party. Hope you enjoy what Matt has to say.
We need to invest with our heart and with both hands together and give people the opportunity to share with us what their concerns are as well. I mean, one of the issues that we've been working on for the last year was developing a better mental health, I'll say, system, but really it's a collection of all the parts that we already have as well.
Yeah.
And you know, there are clinical approaches and there are research approaches and there are government investments that can be made, but at the end of the day, what seems to be most important, and again, this is what I think is happening with play, is the social transformation that can take place so that it's okay for young people to sit around at the table, talk about on the phone with others, you know, the idea that we're not always in our best mental state, and it's okay to talk about mental health challenges.
Yes.
It's okay to do that.
We all have a version of that. We're human.
That's right. That's right.
Highs and lows. So do you think a politician could make a difference? Because that's almost counterintuitive. In some ways, the role of politician, and it's generic, has almost evolved as a status quo. So we play around the edges, but the economy fluctuates 2 to 3% unless there's an anomaly like 2009. Growth rates don't change, but even that's one, like growth rate in the economy is going to have to stop at some point because it's a finite universe with a doubling population, and so maybe it's a distribution economy instead of a growth economy. So do you think the politician makes the difference, or does the politician maintain the status quo? Does change come from a politician? Or
well, change can only come from the politician, and I'll go back to using the word the public servant, right? Because I really think that that's what that representative is. If the change can only come if they take the time to listen to the diverse voices and opinions around them, and then are able to represent those in a fair way amongst all the other voices that exist, brought to the table by all your other public servants or representatives. I think the term advocate works here as well.
Okay.
And my version of what an advocate truly is someone who makes sure that an issue is at least presented in a fair way amongst the larger discussion. An advocate doesn't try and force an issue into prominence or force a solution, but they make sure that the issue is on the table, and that if a dialogue can be encouraged, that it's given its fair place before a decision is made. You know, just in my experience in New Brunswick, we punch well above our weight in all kinds of different areas, providing space for the mental health conversation is just one such area, and we have a Francophone population, an Anglophone population, we have First Nations communities, we have a vibrant newcomer community, we have rural and urban realities. We have so much to offer. But we need a strong voice ensuring that what we have to offer is presented as part of the federal government's conversation on the role that it plays and the role that we play amongst our federal colleagues.
And it's so much more than just economic development. Usually the media storyline is about a COA. So when they think of federal government, they think of Atlantic Canada. The next thing tends to be, you know, Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, and it's economic development. And there's so many other things that come first.
That's right, yeah.
Which is what you're speaking to, the wellness of a community, the role the politician has. As you spoke to the bringing voices to the table and having it be part of a larger conversation, I can imagine some people in the audience will go right away to the conflict or the cacophony that's going on with all those voices competing for the win, so that their issue felt it won. It got the policy change. On a provincial level, I'm thinking of the minimum wage thing.
Right.
You know, a lot of work went into shifting that minimum wage, and then a whole bunch of work went into the pushback from the federal independent business bunch. Yeah. That conversation needs a solution, because both had good merits.
Right.
But still nothing happened. They canceled each other out for a 6-month window and then minimized it for the next year and stuff. You're going to sit right in that hot seat. So,
I think part of the challenge is not to be drawn into a false dichotomy that one thing has to be A or B. You know, to use the minimum wage example a little bit, you know, if we heighten the minimum wage, then businesses have to lay off employees because they can't afford it. So we can only do what we can only have these businesses operating, or we can only have minimum wage, has become the argument that is understood, I guess, out in the media, out in the community. Yeah. And it's important not to get drawn into that false dichotomy.
That's a great point. And there's another issue that attaches to that, which is the need for media reform. Because
yes.
the media keeps bringing that story back in that same dualistic approach.
Can I bring it back to a focus on children?
Do it.
The fact that children and youth have a right to be informed and have a, you know, an opportunity for objective information collection, and that speaks directly to the role of the media in ensuring that they provide the type of information to young people and to the broader community, which will inform the discussion and not, you know, create, once again, I'll say, you know, a false dichotomy between A or B.
Yeah.
You know, we all have, you know, a lot going on as New Brunswickers, as Atlantic Canadians, and what we can offer to the rest of Canada, and it's important that we consider the conversation a Canadian conversation and not just New Brunswick as part of the Federation, right? I mean, that I think that creates silos between what we want and what the next province and next province or next region want. We're all part of a country, Canada. Yeah. We're not just a series of parts within a federation.
Yeah. I want to take another turn. We have about 10 minutes or so left.
Wonderful.
You, kind of focus it on you. So, in general terms, Joe Q. Public will have an election happen, they'll speed in the media or see on television, here's the candidates. And you'll do your best to tell your bio.
That's right.
You know, and you'll have 30 words here or 100 words there on a brochure. And what never gets spoken about is what motivates or encourages people before the fact. So that's the moment we're in now, is before the fact. Like, why do you want to do this? And the sense I get from you is that notion of public service. But you're talking 1950s and 60s mindset about what public service was compared to how Joe Q. Public sees a politician nowadays, which is more like self-interest as opposed to public service. So you want to bang on the public service drum a little bit?
You know, I think what interests me to do it is the idea of public service, but what interests me to do it now specifically, you know, at a relatively young age, and you know, there's been a lot of public servants younger than me who have been elected to office, especially recently.
Yep.
You know, I think the diversity of experience I've had for someone in their early 30s gives me an understanding of the complexity of a lot of different conversations and a lot of different public policy implications out there. And I think it's important to have someone with the ability to understand the diversity and complexity of things, as opposed to someone who comes to the table with a specific wedge issue that they care about, and I won't say to the exclusion of, but to maybe
priority over.
Yeah, a priority over a lot of other things. I mean, I see a real connection between having a robust, socially just system in place, the connection between that and a vibrant economy and development within community that creates jobs and opportunities for people to participate in citizenship. Mm-hmm. You know, and that requires being able to work and make a living and provide for your family, and when faced with health challenges, be able to access the the healthcare system in whatever form it takes to be able to get back to work and to enjoy recreational opportunities and play and the arts and culture of the community. That's all a part of it. So I see a real connection there.
So you see that as a role for the MP?
I think the MP has to help ensure that communities are socially just, economically robust, and environmentally sustainable. Absolutely. And I think I have a penchant for wanting to do that, having come from a number of different experiences and using the things I've learned from all of those, you know, to listen and when a specific issue does come up, understand it from different viewpoints.
Yeah, complex viewpoints.
Yeah.
It's going to change, assuming a lot of other pieces fall in place for you, it's going to change your life a whole bunch.
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. I'm excited for it. I mean, I'm motivated to be active. I love sitting with people. If I had the opportunity to have conversations like this away from the camera every day, I'd be happy to do so. You know, I drink lots of coffee, so I'm okay with that type of lifestyle.
Hadn't noticed.
Yeah, really. I'm physically active and know that I can keep that up. I have wonderful support from parents and my sister and girlfriend and friends, and I feel an intangible as well as tangible support from the community as well, and that's positive. And I hope that other nomination contestants and other candidates get that same type of support, because I really think it can enrich the debate when it comes to election time. And those things can get catty and negative, but I really think if you have people who come with strong support for the candidates, and those candidates are able to be inclusive of the viewpoints of their supporters, but as well as the viewpoints of other people's supporters, then it can be a really enriching experience. And so to be honest, win, lose, or draw, I see this as a positive for myself. I see it as a positive for the political party I've chosen to seek election for, but I see it as a real positive for the community as well.
Yep. The part of your uphill climb will be getting the public to understand it is possible for a person to go in with a cooperative mindset as opposed to the competitive wedge issue kind of mindset. And shoot, I just had it. It was a really good point that you had slid in. It was about the divisiveness and about you can bring all the different points of view together in one voice compared to there are some politicians from the past who said, I was elected, I won, so I get to espouse my views. And so whether it was about gay rights, because there was an MP out of St. John that, you know, just stay home and shut up about it.
Right.
And when challenged about that, her response was, I was the one that won, so those people voted for me because that was my view. And there needs to be a shift occur, and you seem to be representing that shift, that it isn't your view, it's the amalgam.
I hope that people would vote for me because they know I'll listen to them when things of importance matter to them. And I really think that a representative within a constituency has to represent the collective view of that constituency, and it can be very divergent, but and if they can't represent everybody every time, they have to at least be willing to sit and listen and understand before making a tough decision. And you know, I would never profess to be able to satisfy everybody every time, but I would hope, and my hope is that people will understand me as someone who will listen and take the time to, as much as possible, understand their view. Yeah,
and in support of that energy, you'll need a community to shift a little bit from seeing politicians as get me what I want,
sure,
as a vehicle to get what they want,
sure,
into understanding the role that their want fits into a whole milieu of other wants.
I don't think I'm unique in this view of wanting politics to be done a certain way, and I'd prefer to talk about it in community development and community enhancement to be done that way. I think there, again, if we look to young people, and you know, that could be very young to early adulthood and beyond, I think they want a more inclusive, equitable, and fair approach to decision making and progress within their communities.
Cool. About a minute left. You got final thoughts?
Well, look, I mean, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I know you always say, Dennis, but the conversation in some way is what it's really about. The action stems from the conversation that you're willing to have with people, and I truly believe that. And to be able to start this about play and to have a playful approach to this conversation has been a lot of fun. And I think if I could leave people with one thing, it is provide space for young people to be creative, to get involved, to express themselves, lose control of the message a little bit, and allow people to find their own way and support them in that.
We also had the pleasure of interviewing Andrew Graham, who's the NDP candidate for New Brunswick Southwest. Hope you enjoy what Andrew has to say. At times it can be quite intense or detailed, but that is part of the job requirement to be an MP representing you. Hope you enjoy also how Andrew brings a certain passion and a certain connectedness to the people from his riding.
It's not just policy, because the approach of giving a shopping list to voters, I think is somewhat shallow. I think voters at this time have become skeptical, and I think justifiably so, of promises. I think, I mean, for the federal NDP, we don't have a track record of being in government to go on. But if we judge, the Liberal and Conservative governments by their track record, we can see some loopholes in their promises that they've given over the years. What I've tried to do in this riding is to speak a different language. And sometimes that's initiated by people when they start the conversation. It has to do with values, and it also has to do with behavior and my own track record. This is now my 4th time. No one for the NDP has ever run in this riding 4 times in a row. Yep. And I decided to run a 2nd time after my 1st election. We got our highest results ever. And I thought, that's what it takes. Next time we're going to start early. None of this messing around at the last minute, because one of the things I've told people, hundreds of people, I've said, if we don't show by our actions, by our commitment, how devoted we are to our principles, how do we expect other people to adopt or take notice of our principles and our policies? If we don't show that same resolve and a sense of purpose ourselves. So I ran a 2nd time, and of course after election you get a little burnt out.
Yes, it's high energy.
If more people ran in an election, they would know. Yeah. They wouldn't take all this stuff for granted. Especially the last election, the 3rd. I thought that would be the last one, but I keep coming back. I don't know why. I don't know, except I've invested so much time into understanding the policies, and I say not just when we talk about policy, not just like the 2-line policy, but understanding the background of the policies. And this comes from being with different organizations like the National Farmers Union, a really great grassroots organization. I admire their fighting spirit to protect small farms and rural communities. And they have a great website with all kinds of information and top-notch research. The Council of Canadians is another group. And of course the Conservation Council here in New Brunswick. And these things have informed me about not just how important the issues are, but how important it is to have someone fighting for those issues in government and putting them into effect. And so I keep coming back because that need is still there, and I don't know how long I'll keep doing it. But so far I figure, like I said about other countries, you hear about some candidates or people, activists in other countries being tortured or gunned down or whatever, disappeared, and I'm thinking, well, I get burnt out. Whoa, whoopee me. That's not much of a martyr card, getting burnt out.
Risk factor.
Yeah, I can go off and have do some gardening, chill out, do some carpentry, and after so many months or a year, I'm back. Sure, I've sacrificed some time, but I think it's worth it.
It sounds like your, as an overview, your approach is more one of representation as opposed to being in power. So one of the ways political parties will debate or will present themselves during an election is vote for us and we'll do this. That's an implication of power. Put us in power or we do these things back for you. That's the implication of a reciprocal arrangement of some kind. It also is quite divisive in its approach, because you have to vote a certain way in order to get the return. Your approach sounds like you would rather be the representational model. So here's a set of values or principles. I'll adhere to them so you can always trust me while I'm performing for you or acting on your behalf.
I'm glad you mentioned that.
That's asking the voter to make a huge shift. It's like saying, oh, vote this way, but we don't know what will happen in concrete terms, because that's what the other entities will use.
Yes.
Say, we'll build these bridges, build these roads. But it sounds like we might be on the cusp of voting for other reasons different from predicted outcomes.
Yeah.
And thank you for wandering in, because the first question I gave you wandered into a pretty gray area. But that's a national conversation that needs to be had about why do people vote? Do they vote for predicted outcomes, or do they vote for a set of principles, and that will guide the outcomes?
Yeah, and not just principles, but values, and sometimes those are reflected in concrete terms. You know, some of the things that we've lost in the past 4 years have been the Canadian Wheat Board, which was the manifestation of the values of many thousands of farmers out west.
Yes.
And there had been a kind of wheat board before that in the 30s. I don't remember the exact history of it all, but one of them went by the wayside, and then they refined it and rebuilt it, and they came up with the Canadian Wheat Board, which had stood the test of time for decades, and was a way of the grain farmers, wheat and barley farmers, to pool their resources and get a decent stake in the market where they'd always been vulnerable to these huge grain companies. And this was a single desk entity that gave them marketing power and some kind of equity in the market. And even though most of the farmers still supported it, over 60%, the Harper Conservatives unilaterally dismantled it and then almost gave it away to Bunge, which is an American company and a Saudi state-owned company. That was a Canadian success story. Canadian wheat is one of the most.
It's part of our identity.
It is. It's a worldwide star in the grain market.
Yep.
Because it's highly rated. Yep. And grain, when it was dismantled, a bunch of Canadian farmers tried to repurchase it.
Yep.
And they were just ignored.
Yep.
So that's when it comes to values, the mixture between values and concrete actions as a portrayal of what the people wanted. And so I guess what I'm saying is it's not always so woolly. It isn't always just values and principles.
We were just chatting about responsibility between working in the House of Commons and complex and powerful decisions there, and in representing your constituents. That's a natural tension. It's a natural dance between being the voice of the people who voted you in and the responsibility to the team when in the House of Commons. Can you speak a little bit to that tension? Do you have thoughts on what kind of communication methods you'd have between the community that elected you, and then if you're caught in a tough spot or in a great spot with whatever goes on in the House of Commons and bringing it back and forth?
I think it's critical that on some issues that I bounce ideas back between the constituents and myself. Knowing that they elect me to be a leader of this riding in a certain degree, to make judgment calls. But you're right. I think there are some where I think they would appreciate various town halls, or even on a website. I could have kind of a poll, some way of registering how they feel about it.
Yeah, you need a feedback loop. with the grassroots, so they feel like you're still representing them, even though the decision you might have to make isn't sort of what they wanted, and then you need to be able to get back to them to explain, well, why on a national scale this plays out this way, on a local scale this doesn't. The one that pops to mind the most, and it's a values thing too, is when Elsie Wayne was the MP out of St. John. And it had to do with gay pride and all that stuff. And Elsie became famous and put us on the map one more time for standing up in the House of Commons and going, why can't they just stay home and shut up about it? And when challenged by media about those are your personal views, Ms. Wayne, but what about your constituents' views? Her comeback, if I recall correctly, was, I was voted by the people because of my values. So it's my values that represent them. And then the reporters went to town after that about how that resolved. But in a way, that narrative still exists today, not necessarily that topic, but that balance between the role of the MP to represent constituents and the role of the MP in the House of Commons to make good policy for Canadians. Thoughts about how to do that? Yeah, it's hard to do before the fact, but you've been at this 3 or 4 times now, so you've wandered into it mentally at least.
Yeah, it's...
is it always a rock and a hard place, or is there a way to make it better than?
Well, I guess I mentioned before how there's all kinds of facets of society and facets of ourselves, even and facets of ourselves that we struggle with, that we know aren't perfect, and sometimes that will come out. There's some things, there's like, people make jokes that they don't say in public, but they'll say it, they'll have a good laugh in private, and they're colorful jokes, but they will say, hopefully not, racist or homophobic, but it's the kind of thing that they say it's not, not in good taste. But there's certain values that come out like that. Sorry, what was her name?
Elsie Wayne?
Yeah, Elsie Wayne. That are repugnant to people, or to a large majority of people. And part of that is due to a growth in society. What may have been acceptable, 40 years ago, even 20 years ago, may not be acceptable now. And politicians, anybody has to realize that. We could see in the South the changes that are happening there, although it's amazing that they're still having this racial strife, after all these decades after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think people are expecting at least politicians to be at least with the times. That's being said, of course, it is good to be honest. And I don't know. It's a difficult.
Yeah, I gave you a sort of a tough one, and you slid into like a social issue, which is partly my fault because of the kind of example I used. I was more curious about, is it possible for a constituency to still support their MP, even though the decision the MP had to make on a national level didn't really resonate well with back in the constituency? So, this ties to the theme we opened the show with in a way. Voters need to change. It's not just politicians or candidates that need to change. The voters need to change how they do things. So can you see or feel within a voter that there's some wiggle room now, that yes, we elected you, and it's not based on a return on my vote, but it's about a set of principles or values, and therefore when you go to the House of Commons, I can still see that you're adhering to your values even though I don't like the way that you voted. Have we grown up enough yet to be able to have that balance?
I'm hoping so, because when I realize, I think if a lot of the conservative people, conservative people in this riding, who are more formally PC, if they only really knew what the federal Conservative government has done, using their mandate with only, basically 24% of the electorate who voted for them, if they knew the full extent or really opened their eyes to it, I think they would be shocked. So yeah, I think it would be an affront to their values, knowing how much they've undercut, you know, the farmers in this country, and exported, you know, so many jobs, you know, hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs.
Were the seeds of that set in motion back in '88 with the free trade agreement?
Yes.
Is that just a continuum of a storyline that started some time ago with the exporting of jobs?
It is a continuation, and actually, you know, I guess it's worth mentioning that it was started under the free trade agreement in '88, and then under the Liberals with NAFTA in '93, and then, you know, since then with the Conservatives, federal Conservatives under Harper, there have been more free trade agreements signed than almost anywhere before in history, with even countries such as Honduras and Colombia, which have really terrible human rights records, especially in Honduras, which had a coup, which rubber stamped by our conservative government. And so many of these things it should be contrary to the values of Canadians, the way it's done, the underhanded way they've undercut the economic, you know, democratic freedoms of other countries. And part of it, you're right, part of it is this conversation that needs to happen. It doesn't happen enough in this province because of the, you know, corporate-owned print media, you know, Irving and all.
Do they really carry that much weight, do you think?
Well, they could do more, I think. They could.
Ah, okay.
I just think as a responsibility of a paper is not to I know it's their paper, but it's a public paper, and it should not be run as I think.
It's part of a provincial narrative that could be a little more inclusive, maybe.
I think so.
A little more open, or more the old school journalist thing.
Yeah.
But to challenge it a little bit, print media continues to die off. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's fewer and fewer people reading the paper. Yes. So what are the other roles of media that could come up in order to make that better? And I want to go back also to that larger conversation you talk about on a national scale. There was a time when Canada was ranked a certain way in the world.
Yes.
We're not anymore.
No.
You can pick any one of 10 different categories from the World Health Organization or the UN, or we used to be. Do you, maybe on a positive note, and it ties to the media work, because the conversation needs to change, the narrative needs to change. Do you see a way that Canada can remember itself from the 50s and 60s, when that planted some of the early seeds of what was Canadian? We got our Constitution, we got our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Something shifted in the mid-'80s as to how we organized ourselves. Is it time now for it to shift back to the values from the 50s and 60s? And that in turn helps us with World Health Organization or with local provincial media being more inclusive? There
are a number of things that have to change. And one of them, just to get out of the way right from the start, is the corporate media monopoly in Canada. Senator Keith Davey started a commission back in about 1970. Then there was the Kent Commission around 1980 or so. Then there was another one, I think, 15 years ago? I forget. And all of these commissions about media monopoly have done very little. And that has to change so that people have more of an ability to hear the straight news. And I'm not trying to be the arbiter of what the news is, but when I hear different organizations like like Rabble.ca and so many others, Democracy Now! In the States, and when you hear the news coverage that they're giving, and it's not reflected in the main media or even on the CBC, that's a problem. And even the CBC has been stacked with a number of directors who are conservative donors. That has to change. It's no longer arm's length. It's becoming, well, it's becoming like a media senate.
Yeah, it's an extension.
Yeah. So that has to change. The other thing is our growth as a country. We've realized now with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've realized the crimes of our country against one of the most vulnerable people. And I think a lot of Canadians want that to change. The current Conservative administration, they're not on board. That has to change. So we have to have some kind of redress to be partners with all of these First Nations people across Canada and restore all the rights and the dignity that they are owed. That has to change, like ASAP. Not, and we have to get rid of this tokenism. You know, talk is cheap. You know, an apology doesn't cut it. We need actions. But also regarding trade agreements, these have many of these trade agreements either have to be rewritten or revoked. Our bridge just signed another one with China last year, the Foreign Investment Protection Agreement with China. And apparently we can't get out of that for another 15 years. But China has investments in the Alberta tar sands. So if we want to address climate change, now we have to revoke some agreement with China and pay heavy fines probably. So we have to rewrite our own sovereignty. We have locked ourselves into these agreements, these trade agreements. There's another one with the EU, Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. And there's another one too, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the United States is part of. And if we're locking ourselves into these agreements, we're hamstringing our own ability to take care of our health care. That could be undercut, water management and pharmaceuticals, and even local procurement by federal, provincial, or municipal governments. All these things could be undercut by foreign corporations. And if they don't get it, they could sue. And this is what our governments have done. They've undercut our own sovereignty. They've dissolved this jurisdictional integrity of our courts and our regulatory system so that it's weakened, it's diluted what Canada is.
So in building that connection back with the voters, but still bringing all of that knowledge you've got about large-scale issues, how do you want to bring that home? Is it simply that, look, I can go play on this scale because I understand the pieces and parts and all adhere to a set of principles? Or is it going to be just too much of a gap and the local voters won't? Like, how are you going to connect with the local voter on what you've just done? Which this show is part of it, and provide that chance for other people too. But at some point, for me, the voter still needs to change.
Yes.
So how are you going to reach them? Tough question.
Well, to me, you're right. The biggest challenge is to convert some of what I've said to condense it or distill it into manageable ideas in a couple sentences that they will be able to digest or resonate with.
Yeah, because it gets into, well, what's that got to do with me? Which is what you mentioned earlier. But you have mapped out the past 20 minutes how it will come around to affect you.
And
whether it's milk, or whether it's water, whether it's fish, or whether it's the groceries that you buy.
Yes, and it's discouraging when I see, well, how much the media has ignored, and this is why it makes it harder for me to carry forth on these issues, because the people haven't had enough of that discussion in the media. And the media has to do more of its job. I've written letters to the editor about things like genetically modified wheat and alfalfa. And I mean, I'm sure the dairy producers, they know about it. I talked to some of them in Sussex, and they said, yes, we just discussed that yesterday at our board meeting. No, why would we want GM alfalfa? We don't need that. Well, sure, of course they don't need it. But Monsanto wants it because it gives them more market share. And that is one of the things, GM foods is one of the things that it's a little thing that people are aware of. And what I'm trying to do is make people aware that what happens globally can affect them locally. The increasing monopolization of our economy by corporations, and even the co-opting of our government, is their business. And their option, their playing card is their vote. And if I'm talking like this, I'm not trying to talk down to them. I'm trying to bring them in the conversation and make them aware that I'm on their side and I've done the research. And I'm not just spilling the beans because I think I'm smart. I'm not really that smart. I just read about it, and I feel compelled. The more I read about it, I feel compelled to get my hands in there and do something.
Now, the third of the three candidates we had the chance to interview is Mary Lou Babineau, the Green Party candidate for Fredericton-Ormeaucto. It is a different approach and a different point of view because the attention is more on process than on outcomes. So we hope that you enjoy what Mary Lou has to say and the way she says it.
As I understand it, the social media versus your traditional mainstream television media, they're geared towards two very different demographics. Now, this is a generalization, but I think that statistically it does hold true.
Yep.
That the big ads that you see on TV are geared towards an older population, perhaps of my age and older, and the social media is geared towards people younger than I am. The challenge is that the TV ads are geared towards a demographic that votes in much greater numbers and proportions than social media is geared towards.
Does that still hold true? Like it bears out statistically?
It sure does bear out statistically, yeah.
So
yeah.
the 25-year-olds...
The younger people, they are the ones who are not voting in much larger numbers. It's quite a stark difference.
Goodness, and yet when you think of Occupy, and when you think of the energy around Anonymous and the rest of that, that's where it is. So they haven't quite connected political process with that type of emotional or energy?
No. They seem to be still I can think of a few reasons, I guess, but they seem to be disconnected from the traditional political processes. It's not that they're apolitical.
Well, they're very engaged.
They're very engaged.
Yes.
They're very knowledgeable. They're much more critical than, I'm just talking about my own interactions with people. I teach at a university, so I have a lot of contact with that demographic. They're aware, they're very critical. They care, they're upset, they're not happy with the way things are going, but they don't seem to see a strong connection between their discontent with the way things currently are and this traditional process of going to a ballot box on election day and ticking off a check mark. It's not, the connection's just, it's not being made somehow. Now, this election, because all parties have become aware of this issue, it's become more and more known. There are several movements that are on foot now to try to change that with this election. So I think individual parties, especially the parties that have stronger support within the younger demographic, we are trying to mobilize the vote and to get out the vote. And also I was really pleased at the last Senate meeting in the spring at the university before we broke for summer. The incoming student council spoke about a major campaign that the student governments across the country are putting on foot to get students out to vote. So that's fantastic. Those are great efforts that are being made. It does still, those efforts are going to be geared towards university students, which is a part of that demographic, but it's not the only part. So there are other pieces as well that we have to think about how to reach and to mobilize them to get out to vote. Because the fact of the matter is, if you look at the numbers, they could change the outcome of the whole election. This could be their election.
Yes. And
they could change everything.
And all through social media now, because the writ has been dropped, you will find various versions of artwork and Pinterest posts and posters about, governments, bad governments are good people elected by people who don't vote.
Exactly.
It's just trying to get to connect. And that's cute little play on words and stuff. It still might not get someone to understand they need to engage.
Right.
Long lost is that sense of awareness of responsibility towards country for the legacy that's come over the 100 years and all those that came before to create the world that we're all now living in.
Yes.
Which then slides to the election that you're into, which is politics has become about being in power as opposed to representation and governance. And do you want to speak to those themes? And because that's very much something you had to make peace with before you became a candidate.
Yes, it is. It's a challenge, and it's very interesting to engage with a system that operates or has come to operate in certain ways that run counter to my own values and to the values of the Green Party. And I think that you nailed it with this sort of summary of politics has become about staying in power and being in power, and perhaps serving certain isolated interests within our society, but not representing everyone to the best of one's capacity. And so the Green Party does work very hard to try to counter that. And I have to say there's something very hopeful within this campaign that I have seen over the past few months of canvassing and of speaking with people, and that is, as you know, we have a great role model now in Fredericton. David Coon was elected in September, and so people have had the chance to see him in action. And the connection is being made. And when I talk to people now, as opposed to 2008 when the Green Party was not so well known, we didn't even have, Elizabeth May was not even an MP yet in 2008. She was running against Peter MacKay in Nova Scotia. We didn't have David Coon, we didn't have Peter Bevan Baker in Prince Edward Island. So it was still just an ideal at the time. One was talking to the constituents, and and was trying to explain the principles upon one was running, in my case, myself, that these are the ways that the Green Party envisioned the job of an elected representative as being engaged, as being visible, as being accessible, and as being responsive. So those were ideals, but now, 7 years later, they're not just ideals. Now we have a couple of models who are living this and are working this way, and people refer to those models so often at the door, and that's really exciting. So when I go to the door, I hear stories that people say, well, you know, I just sent David Kuhn an email last week and he responded, and they seem shocked by that, you know, and part of you wants to say yay, and the other part of you wants to cry because you think, oh my gosh, is this how low the bar has sunk, that people are surprised when an elected representative would answer an email, you know, that's awful. And then we have Elizabeth May on a national level, who's been awarded and voted as hardest working MP and most respectful MP. She's just had all of this recognition for her particular style of working, right? So those are exciting things that I think people are making the connections and are thinking, okay, there is another way. There is another way. Politics does not have to be about particular personalities who are running because of the attractiveness of being in power. Politics can be about electing people who really care about their communities, who want to know what people's issues are, and who want to know how they can help, and who want to work with everyone in the community, and not just a few, and who are willing to go to the community, to go to them, instead of sitting in an office and waiting for people to come to us, or hiding behind, or not answering emails. So that's been probably the brightest light of the campaign this time, as opposed to 2008.
The other thing that's still going to be a challenge, though, and to challenge you a bit, to go a bit deeper into it, is that you're speaking to a different process. What we're going to get for the next 11 months, especially from the party in power and the Liberal Party that typically has been in power, is you're going to get a lot of talk about outcomes. We got this much money into this constituency. We got this much money for this company. It's always about moving money around.
Yes.
They very rarely speak about engagement. They'll do a consultation process, but that's a tough one. When a government shows up saying they want to do a consultation, most people will make a face, because it's become tough over the past 20 years to trust that process.
Yes.
You're trying to introduce a new process.
Yes.
When you say, I'll go to the community, I'll meet them there. How are you going to get people to believe that that's going to make a difference?
Well, I think that
it's a tough question, but that's the difference. Is it outcomes or is it process? And will people vote for process instead of voting for controlling outcomes?
Right.
Has that moment arrived yet?
I think it has arrived, and I think that it is because people are not at all convinced that the outcomes that they want are arriving. In fact, the opposite seems to be the impression of the people that I'm talking to. So people might have traditionally been willing to give more weight to this outcomes piece, as opposed, and maybe sacrifice or not prioritize the process or the engagement piece if they felt like their needs were being met. But that's not the perception anymore. Not in this part of the country, certainly not in our riding. Now the more common perception that I'm hearing is we're being cut, we're not getting what we need, we're being promised many things during campaigns that once a government is in power, they're not following through with. Our family members are all moving out to Alberta to work because there is not sufficient local sustainable employment. Our heating bills are going up. Our environment's not being protected. These are the kinds of things, you know, and they're noticing that at a local and a federal level. And so I'm not sure that the outcomes piece it's not something that's ever been brought up. No one has ever said to me, well, I think that if we elect one of the traditional parties, we will get more of what we want. What they're saying is, I'm so tired of being disappointed. by unfulfilled promises made by traditional parties that I'm starting to think about other options. So I'm happy you came, I'm willing to read your material, and I'm going to give this some serious thought.
Yeah. And I want to wander more into that process stuff, because it hasn't worked for the past 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
New Brunswick or Atlantic Canada is still more or less in the same state it was.
Yeah.
Aging populations, crumbling infrastructure, a small population can't leverage the big decisions out of Ontario or Quebec or Alberta. And then there's one MP, you know, who so can the attention and the learning curve you're going to have to teach people about this new way, which is actually an old way.
Yes, it is.
About how to all get together.
Yes, it's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and what do we want to do about it? And then does that help get it when, say you win and you're in Ottawa? Are there things that can be done that don't involve money, that help a riding be better?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that theme, because the theme of politics, and when we say the word on the street, people will turn away.
Yes, they do.
They'll have a negative emotional reaction to it. And there was a time politics represented when we all came together to make shared decisions.
Yes.
When I listen to your Green Party stuff, it harkens back to that other era.
Yeah.
So can you share some stories where maybe you've had a couple of people where the light bulb went on and went, oh, that's what you guys are trying to do? Because they'll want you to talk in terms of outcomes. Well, what are your promises? What's your platform? What will you do?
Yeah, well, I think that an interesting question was made of Elizabeth May recently. Somebody asked her, if you had to summarize your party in one word, what would it be? And they said, I suppose it would be the environment. And she said, no, it wouldn't be the environment, it would be democracy. Yeah. If I had to summarize it in one word, it would be democracy. And it has to do with exactly that. It has to do with restoring faith through leadership. I think that's what it comes down to, restoring faith and restoring trust through leadership. And people who see that in action comment. And the day after the federal debates, I was out canvassing, and a woman said to me, I've never voted Green before, but I watched the debates last night. And it starts with the basic sense of responsibility of answering a question directly, which I think is something that people say Elizabeth is so wonderful in debates, and she is wonderful. She is the most intelligent, articulate woman that I know personally. But most of all, if you listen to her, what you're going to see is that she just answers the question. She doesn't go to a talking point. She doesn't talk about something else that she wants to, doesn't make a plug. She just answers the question. And so people, already a little light bulb goes off when they think, okay, there's a connection. Then this person's asking a question, I'm asking, and I'm getting an answer, right? And I get that comment often personally as well. The trust starts there. The connection between a leader and the people that that leader represents begins there. If you ask me a question, I will tell you the answer. And you might not like the answer, and sometimes they don't. We get asked at the door questions sometimes, and I'll tell them what our position is, because it's in black and white. Everything is on the internet, and I'm not talking out of, I can't, even if I wanted to talk out of both sides of my mouth, it would be impossible, because they can go look. They'll say, what's your position on fracking, for example? And I'll say, well, I don't know what your position is, and maybe you won't like this, but we are against fracking. And they say, you're wrong, we don't agree with this. And we get into a bit of a conversation about it, you know, and then sometimes, not always, but it has happened that at the end, one man in particular comes to mind because he was quite upset with my answer, but by the end of it he said, you know what, I'm probably going to vote for you anyway, just because you told me the truth, just because you answered my question. And I think that basic active communication, now I'm a language teacher, so I have this tremendous faith in words and the integrity of words and language and the ability to connect through language. And I think that when you are straightforward with people, that the seed of trust begins there. And I think that as leaders, we have a responsibility, once elected, to follow through with those kinds of, I take it many, 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 many steps farther. I think that we need to be visible and accessible. I think we need to be inviting and engaging, and I think that we need to be the ones going out to meet people. Because people are busy, and you see this at the door. You walk into people in all kinds of, you know, they're putting their kids to bed, they're going from one job to another, the one partner's coming in off the day shift, the other one's leaving on their night shift for their job. Politics is not, as you say, the top of mind
It's not
thing,
top of mind.
and they don't. And if you're coming from a position of not having a lot of faith in politicians, then why is that person going to be your go-to if you have an issue or a problem or something's not working for you or your family or your community? But as leaders, it's our responsibility to be going out, to be visible, to be going out to every community activity possible, to be holding meetings within different polls or different parts of the riding, so that we're constantly inviting people, please come to me, please talk to me, even if I don't like, or even if what you're saying I don't have a quick answer to or a quick fix to, but please come and talk to me because I want to know where you're at.
Yep.
And people at the door often will say, well, I'll tell you, one guy said to me, I'll tell you, but you're not going to like what I have to hear. You're not going to want to hear what I have to say. He said, you're not going to want to hear what I have to say. And I said, well, that's where you're wrong, because campaigns can be run in many, many ways.
Yeah.
And if I didn't want to hear what you have to say, I could sit in my office and I could just send you fancy newsletters.
Yeah.
But I'm here, and I will listen to what you want to say because I do want to hear it.
So the next step following that theme would be a picture of the House of Commons after the federal election. And it's multicolored.
Yeah.
And there's a certain culture in this country, and it's like they've forgotten the Trudeau minority years, you know. Some of the most progressive...
The Pearson minority years.
Yeah, and the Trudeau ones. A lot of progressive legislation happened during that window of time. And it's always fascinated me why one of the narratives we have is that government can't function if there's a minority government.
I know.
When history shows us over and over again the most dynamic period we have for adapting to social change or implementing dynamic policy was when the debate in the House involved all these different voices rather than one dominant voice, and then we're going to power through our legislation. So do you want to speak to what would, in your view, what would the House look like if it had, you know, several different voices in it, and what that could bring if the Green Party voice was on the floor, but a few more numbers, you know.
Right.
It doesn't look like, anyway, just play with that space.
Yeah.
Because people need to hear what that might be like, rather than they just get the old narrative of it doesn't work.
Yeah. It's supposed to work. It's our system as a parliamentary democracy is designed in such a way that parties are supposed to cooperate. These parties are supposed to represent, or the makeup of the parliament is supposed to be a reflection of the will of the people. Now, it's another debate about how our first past the post system does it or does it not really, how close does it come to actually representing the will of the people, but let's say to a degree.
Yeah, or is it the political party system versus first past the post?
Yeah, they're both, the representation piece and the working together piece, it's kind of all connected, right? And people have forgotten, not only it's an interesting chicken and egg question. Is it that people have forgotten and so the parties don't behave that way anymore? Or did parties stop behaving that way and then people eventually forgot that that's the way that they're supposed to behave? Coalitions are the name of the game with parliamentary governments. That's the way it is. We're not the US system. So we vote a parliament, we vote caucus, we have a caucus from each party, and then it's up to those people to work together. That's the way it's supposed to be. And as you cited, some of our very best examples of moving projects forward and of moving this country forward came from eras where we had a minority government. Our healthcare system, for example, came from a minority government. And I think that it is a system where its strength, if there are some weaknesses to it as well, but I think that its strength is that it pushes parties to work together. And it pushes parties to talk, to debate, and to make compromises, and to get things done. That is what we're supposed to be doing. But instead, what's happened over time is that some parties have decided that they're not going to work with other parties anymore. We will not have coalitions.
Well, it'll break down on your ideological lines like fracking or no fracking.
Yeah.
Rather than, okay, how do we keep the whole together while making a decision that's tough, you know? Because your responsibility is for some major difficult decisions.
It is, yeah.
But I didn't want to interrupt the flow about your coalition building theme.
Yeah, so the coalition is important. That's the model that we're supposed to be following and that parties are supposed to be following when they are in a minority government situation. And it's not that it doesn't work. It works if parties are willing to make it work, but it certainly doesn't work if parties take the position that we will not work with party X, or we will not work with party Y, or we won't work with party X as long as person A is at the helm, or any of these sort of. Elected representatives work for people, work for Canadians, and they owe people more than that. We don't get to say who we're going to work with, and in what working context do we decide that we're going to work with people and not work with people? That's just completely absurd to take that position. That's being irresponsible with your responsibility. And I would just love to continue to be engaged in changing the way that elected representatives interact with and are responsive to their constituents. I'd like to continue to be part of a process that restores some faith in our politicians, in our elected representatives. I think it's possible. We're seeing it happening, and I think we just need more of it, and I'm excited to be a part of that. That's what I dearly, dearly want.
So we hope you've enjoyed what we were able to bring together as a conversation that matters on politics in the current federal election. As always, please remember that everything is connected, and when you vote, you're voting for the person in your riding, not necessarily for the leader. Thank you again for your time and attention. As always, be good, have fun, and love each other.